What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through the top waiver wire targets heading into week 4 of the NFL season. So talking about running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, also some defenses that I'd be looking to stream. These are going to be players that are rostered in 40% or fewer leagues using the ESPN Fantasy Football waiver wire. Any questions, drop them down below. If you ask a question, you find the video helpful, just do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe. But let's just dive right into the running back position here. And I think there are some interesting options at running back, both in the short term and the long term here. So starting off with probably my favorite pickup this week, it's going to be Bucky Irving. He's rostered in 32.8% of leagues. And Bucky Irving is someone who I've talked about as a sleeper heading into the season. He's someone who I've liked as a waiver wire pickup after the first couple of weeks. But I think this might be like the last call here on Bucky Irving, at least before he actually has like a real breakout game. This was just another game here in week 3 where Bucky Irving outplayed Rachaad White. He actually outcarried him also, had 9 carries for 70 yards compared to 6 carries for 17 yards for Rachaad White. And this has just been like a 2+ year issue here for Rachaad White, where as a rookie, he averaged 3.7 yards per carry. In his second year, 3.6. Now he's like just barely over 2 yards per carry in the first 3 games here in 2024. So for Bucky Irving, like I feel like you can only hold him off for so long here. If he's just going to continue to outproduce Rachaad White, at some point these touches are going to flip, and maybe they did flip here in week 3. You know, Rachaad White still kind of dominated the routes. He dominated the overall snaps, but we did see Bucky Irving get more carries. Like I said, he was far more productive. So I think within a few weeks, Bucky Irving might end up just being the outright starter. In worst case scenario, he's still a decent handcuff if the Bucs somehow still continue to roll with Rachaad White. So I really like Bucky Irving here, someone who I do think has like starting running back upside rest of season. The next guy here, definitely more of a short-term play. We have Cam Akers rostered in 35% of leagues. And this was kind of a tough spot for Akers because he gets the nice opportunity with Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce out of the lineup. But then the Texans just go out and get blown out by the Vikings. So he takes 9 of 11 carries. He takes, 3 targets here. It was just a pretty awful game script for a guy like Cam Akers. So I do think he's startable if Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce miss again. Maybe if Mixon's out and Pierce is back, he's worth an ad because he could be the guy who's playable. But I think, if those two do miss again, Cam Akers could definitely be fired up as a running back too, which could definitely be valuable to have, just for a week or two at this point. The next running back is going to be Braylon Allen, rostered in 28% of leagues. And this was just another game where Braylon Allen had pretty solid usage, even though Breece Hall was healthy. He saw 11 carries, 3 targets on Thursday Night Football. Even though that usage is pretty strong, especially the last couple of weeks, I don't think he's playable week to week yet, at least with a lot of confidence, because we still have Breece Hall dominating the valuable touches. Those are the goal line work, the 2-minute drill opportunities. But it is clear the Jets want to run this offense through their running backs. Breece had a solid workload. It's not like Breece is really being hurt by this. Like, both these running backs are kind of being fed. Both are productive. Worst case scenario, Braylon Allen is like a super, super valuable handcuff, where if Breece Hall goes down, like Braylon Allen is going to be a running back 1. But I do think once we start getting into bye weeks, we have injuries at the running back position. That is a spot where Braylon Allen could be kind of plugged into your lineup here. And who knows, if he continues to produce, he could get some of those more valuable looks. I mean, the dude's an absolute unit, so it's not out of the question for him to kind of get involved here on the goal line. So Braylon Allen, if he wasn't scooped up after last week, this is probably going to be the last shot here to get him in, your competitive leagues. Then after Braylon Allen, we have Rico Dowdle here, who's rostered in 37.4% of leagues. And he actually led the Cowboys running backs in carries and targets. 8 carries for 32 yards, 5 targets, 3 receptions for 24 yards. He also kind of blew Zeke out of the water in terms of snaps. 37 snaps for Rico Dowdle to Ezekiel Elliott's 15. The problem is that he starts to pull away from Zeke, and now they're mixing in their fullback on passing downs, and Rico Dowdle isn't getting all those opportunities. So it's just a tough spot here for Rico Dowdle. I kind of picked him to lead this backfield coming into the season, and I guess he is leading it, but he's not really leading it to a point where he's being fantasy relevant. So I don't think it's worth cutting him. I still think he's worth, being rostered, because if he continues to pull away here, he could definitely be playable in better matchups. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a little bit frustrating that he is technically the lead back, but it's just not leading to anything fantasy-wise. So I'd still hold out here on Rico Dowdle, but like I said, kind of a frustrating first couple of weeks here. Then we have Roshan Johnson, who is almost guaranteed to be available in your league. He's rostered in 0.8% of leagues, and he was a guy who was a healthy and active through the first couple of weeks. He was working through an injury in training camp, but like in terms of the injury report, he was good to go for week 1, week 2. They just did not play him. But then he goes out in week 3, has 8 carries, 5 targets. He led all the Bears running backs in rushing and receiving yards. And this is just a spot here where, despite DeAndre Swift getting a solid contract in free agency, he has been completely terrible through 3 weeks. He is averaging under 2 yards per carry. He has just not been a difference maker at all. So I feel like this is a spot here where the RB1 position could be up for grabs. Roshan Johnson saw a decent workload. I think this Bears offense should improve throughout the season, so it could become like a more desirable backfield to be a part of. And if Roshan Johnson is just like a free lottery ticket within that backfield, I feel totally good about scooping him up. And a lot of your league mates probably aren't going to be, super hip to him, at least heading into week 4. Now, the next guy here, it is going to be Emmanuel Wilson, rostered in 1.9% of leagues. And at this point, with Marshawn Lloyd on IR, he is the clear Josh Jacobs handcuff. And he went out and had a very solid week 3, actually outproduced Josh Jacobs, both like real life and fantasy wise. 12 carries for 50 yards, 2 receptions for 35 yards and a touchdown. With how good this Packers offense has looked, like the fact that they can just plug in Malik Willis and they're just like still cooking, you're going to want pieces of this offense, and Emmanuel Wilson could be a very valuable piece if Josh Jacobs were to go down. So definitely a top tier handcuff to look up, picking up here. Then we have Samaje Perine, who's rostered in 24.7% of leagues. And I kind of went out there and kind of planted my flag on Carson Steele kind of leading this backfield. And that's what we saw. It definitely seems like he's the guy to own within this backfield. But I don't think that makes Samaje Perine like completely irrelevant here. I guess he kind of turns into like the Carson Steele handcuff. I do think in different game scripts where maybe they're trailing, Samaje Perine could be that guy. It's just kind of tough though, because the Chiefs are going to be favored in pretty much every game they're a part of. And if they're not favored, it's going to be like a very, very close line. So it's tough to really bet on like the Chiefs trailing and Samaje Perine getting a lot of receiving work. So I think at this point, tough to see him being playable week to week, but could pretty much become that Carson Steele handcuff here. So I'd say Samaje Perine could definitely still be worth a pickup here. Then we have Jaleel McLaughlin, who's rostered in 36.4% of leagues. And I guess I'll also just throw in Tyler Beatty here, who actually came in kind of out of nowhere. Audric Estime went on IR, and he led the backfield in carries and rushing yards. And I mean, like, he looked decent. McLaughlin and Javonte have been pretty terrible on the ground. I don't know if like Tyler Beatty's going to be the guy who comes in and takes over this backfield, but just looking at this Broncos running back room, it has been gross, but it does seem like the touches are still kind of up for grabs here. And something that I thought was interesting was that Jaleel McLaughlin saw 2 of the 5 goal line carries. He had a goal line touchdown, which was just going to be like a 1-yard touchdown, but I mean, it was a very impressive run to get in there, and he scored on that opportunity. So he was a guy that was ultra efficient last year, that hasn't carried over here into 2024. He's at 2.2 yards per carry through 20 attempts. But I do think this is a spot where he could get better. He could find a little something of what he saw in 2023. And if like Javonte Williams continues to struggle, it's just going to open up more opportunities here for Jaleel McLaughlin, who was the guy that, took the majority of the opportunities in week 1. So it's not like he's completely out of this backfield. The Broncos passing attack looked terrible through 2 weeks. They turned it around in week 3. Maybe Sean Payton can figure something out with these running backs. But like I said, in deeper leagues, Tyler Beatty, I mean, maybe Sean Payton sees he has a decent game and just turns him into the running back 1. I mean, crazier things have happened here. And then the last 2 guys here, just pure running back handcuffs. We have Isaac Guerendo, rostered in 1.7% of leagues. This would be the Jordan Mason handcuff. Saw a couple of opportunities in week 3. And then Ray Davis hasn't played yet, rostered in 9.6% of leagues. The James Cook handcuff. Now, shifting over to the wide receiver position, we have to start off with Jauan Jennings here, rostered in 35.9% of leagues. And admittedly, like, I wasn't super high on Jauan Jennings heading into week 3 here. Typically, when you're trying to start like these depth wide receivers, when the top tier starters go down, it typically doesn't pan out because at the wide receiver position, targets are earned, not given. If you have a backup running back stepping in, you can literally just hand them the ball a bunch of times, right? They don't really have to earn those opportunities. At wide receiver, you actually have to be going out and getting open. And so typically when it's like the running back 3, 4, 5, and they're now stepping into a starting role, it's tough to trust them. But with CMC, Debo, and George Kittle out, Jawan Jennings just went completely nuclear. 11 receptions for 175 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. You just don't see this happen. Like I said, like those depth wide receivers that get pushed into the starting roles, normally they struggle. Jennings went out and just completely dominated. So shout out to him. I mean, we'll see if Debo, Kittle, these guys continue to miss time, but someone who definitely should be rostered in pretty much every league at this point. Because even if Debo's back, like he kind of turns into a wide receiver handcuff because you don't just mess around and go for 11, 175, and 3 touchdowns. Like something is clearly there if you can put together that type of stat line. After Jennings here, we have Romeo Doubs, who's rostered in 26.3% of leagues, and he once again led the Packers wide receivers in routes. It's kind of tough here. The Jordan Love injury has pretty much just like put a freeze on like these Packers wide receivers. We're heading into the season. We didn't really know what to expect. Is Jaden Reed the number one? Is it Christian Watson? Is it Romeo Doubs? Like what's Dontavian Wicks going to do? And we saw like, a 1-game sample size in week 1. But since then, it's been like this low volume passing attack with Malik Willis, where they're kind of just like getting through these games. So I think Doubs could become playable when Jordan Love is back. Just an offense I want pieces of, like I was talking about. And Romeo Doubs, definitely could be one of those guys. Then we have Tutu Atwell, who's rostered in 1.9% of leagues. And based on the week 2 usage, where Cooper Kupp left with injury, Puka Nacua was already out, Tutu Atwell was operating as the wide receiver 4 last week, but he ended up being second in routes run here in week 3, had an 80% route participation, 4 receptions for 93 yards, was definitely the best option for the Rams wide receivers. And I think Tutu Atwell is interesting, at least when Puka and Cooper Kupp are out, because we saw last year with Kupp out of the lineup early on in the season, Atwell rattled off these 3 stat lines: 6 for 119, 7 for 77, and then 4 for 50 and a touchdown. So if Kupp is not playing, Tutu Atwell can be relevant. The fact that they gave him the second most routes, that's a good sign. He produced within those opportunities. So someone who could potentially be playable and honestly might be my favorite Rams wide receiver until those top 2 are back. After Atwell, we have Demario Douglas, who's rostered in 28.5% of leagues. He led the team with an 86% route participation. He was someone that was pretty much non-existent within the offense through the first 2 weeks. Seemed like he was frustrated. It seemed like the Patriots, made an effort to get him more involved. And I thought Douglas could be interesting because he's more of like that slot check down option where you can just kind of feed him targets. It's not like you need the offensive line to hold up to get him the ball. He goes out week 3, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 69 yards. And he's pretty much been the only Patriots pass catcher that's really given him a spark through 3 weeks. So Demario Douglas, who knows? He might be something here, or this just might go back to being a very, very gross wide receiver room. And then the final wideout here, we have Wan'Dale Robinson rostered in 14.8% of leagues. And he's kind of quietly racked up 24 targets through the first 3 weeks. 11.6 PPR points per game. I definitely wouldn't consider him to be like an ideal weekly start, but it does just seem like the wide receiver position is in a desperate place right now. So you could do worse than Wan'Dale Robinson just with some of these underperforming offenses, the injuries to some of the top guys. In deep leagues, who knows? Like Wan'Dale Robinson could end up cracking your lineup. Now shifting into the quarterback position, I have 3 guys here. Starting it off with Justin Fields, who is rostered in 24.1% of leagues. This was probably his best game with the Steelers, both fantasy and from a real-life perspective. They're 3-0 with him at quarterback here. I feel like he has to be the guy moving forward. And week 1, week 2, it kind of just seemed like this offense was treading water. Week 3, they actually trusted him a little bit more, let him use his arm, 25 of 32 for 245 yards and a passing touchdown. And Fields looked like legit good in this game. He was using the middle of the field. He was, fitting the ball into tight windows, put up 18.4 fantasy points, and he only had 6 rushing yards. So the fact that Fields can deliver a solid fantasy day when he's not racking up that rushing volume, I think that's a pretty solid sign. I do think he has a greater rushing ceiling moving forward than we've seen through 3 weeks, but someone who I definitely think is streamable as a quarterback option. And now that he's getting a little bit of job security, maybe a little bit of a safer option moving forward. Then we have Sam Darnold, who's right up there in dudes who just seem to be very playable, rostered in 16.2% of leagues. And this is just a very, very strong start to the season. 19.3 points per game through 3 weeks. He has scored 14 plus points in all 3 games. And this has been without Jordan Addison. It has been without TJ Hawkinson. So Sam Darnold might just become an even better option moving forward. I mean, what Kevin O'Connell is doing there in Minnesota has been amazing. The defense is awesome. Sam Darnold, this offense is kind of cooking through 3 weeks. He had a little bit of an injury scare. Should be fine. I think Sam Darnold definitely playable at the quarterback position. And then the final guy here, Geno Smith, rostered in 27.8% of leagues. This was his worst fantasy game of the season at 11 points, but he hit 17 points the first 2 weeks. The passing volume has been there. He really just hasn't hit with the passing touchdowns, but those should come. I don't think you're ever going to plug Geno Smith into your lineup and feel super confident, but I definitely think he's streamable in the quarterback spot. And then looking at tight end here, I think there are 2 options that are fairly decent, and then the rest of the tight ends pretty much just seem like dust. The first one, Tyler Conklin. We saw him on Thursday Night Football, rostered in 27.7% of leagues, had a 95% route participation. He actually led all the Jets pass catchers in routes run, so that is a great sign. This isn't like, an anti-Garrett Wilson number, like Wilson was right there, but just the fact that you can get a 95% route participation with Aaron Rodgers at the tight end position, that's very interesting. He was targeted 6 times, caught 5 of them for 93 yards. It's just really strong usage on an offense that should be solid and is kind of lacking elite pass catchers outside of Garrett Wilson. And then I guess you can throw Breece Hall in there. So Tyler Conklin definitely should be rostered with how terrible the tight end position is. And then the other guy who I was completely out on heading into the season, and it was due to the usage we saw early on through the first couple of weeks, it's Cole Kmet, who's rostered in 26.1% of leagues. And it seems like Shane Waldron finally used his brain and played Cole Kmet as the tight end 1. We saw in the preseason, it was a split between Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett. Early on in the season, it was like Gerald Everett had completely taken over, which really made no sense because Cole Kmet has been a productive tight end. He's a solid pass catcher. We saw in week 3, he logged a 71% route participation, which isn't even all that great at the tight end spot, but it's a massive improvement from what we've seen in previous weeks. And compared to Gerald Everett's 29%, he was targeted 11 times, caught 10 of them for 97 yards and a touchdown. And at this point, I feel like the cat's out of the bag. You cannot go back to splitting this 50-50 or playing Gerald Everett more than Cole Kmet. He has to be locked in as the tight end 1 here. So I think he's someone who was rightfully released on most fantasy teams here early on through 2 weeks because he had done pretty much nothing. Now I feel like the usage is back, so he's got to be scooped back up here as a decent, probably back-end tight end 1 week to week. And then the final position here, some streaming defenses. I honestly don't think this is the best week to stream defenses, but I think there are still some decent options out there. We have the Bengals rostered in 32.8% of leagues going up against the Panthers. Now, prior to week 3, the Panthers matchup was a dream spot for defenses. That's what you'd be looking for. Obviously now not as great with Andy Dalton at quarterback, but this is still a bottom tier unit. I don't think Dalton's going to go out and have a game like that every single week. Bengals, respectable defense. I think they're a solid option. We have the Colts rostered in 7.8% of leagues, and this Colts defense is not great, but the Steelers offense, they've been a pretty low ceiling unit. I think they're a fine streaming option. If Justin Herbert misses time, I think the Bears have to be the top option here. Rostered in 36.7% of leagues. They're going up against the Chargers. Like I said, if Herbert's out, this offense is looking pretty gross. I think the Bears would be a great option. We have the Raiders rostered in 30.5% of leagues. They kind of disappointed because they seemed like one of the top pickups with the Panthers matchup. Andy Dalton went out, had a legacy game there, but they're going up against the Browns. This Browns offense has looked terrible, so it's tough to fully trust them after they just kind of flopped against the Panthers, but this Browns offense is also bad. And then we have the Cardinals rostered in 0.8% of leagues. Not a super appealing defense, but they have a decent matchup here against the Commanders. So those are some of the streaming options I'd be looking at, and that's going to wrap it up for my top targets at every position. Let me know your thoughts. Any questions, drop them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.